everyone. Chief Rankings Officer Payton Soicher here on the Triple Option with Paul Catalina. We had an insane Week 14, also known as Rivalry Weekend, where all of the teams now have found a place within their top 25, but we had some enormous upsets, and we have one or two ranking enigmas, if you want to call it that, of where these teams are going to be ranked going into Tuesday night's rankings release from the playoff committee. We need to take a look at where the Big 12 sits and how the ACC plays into that Big 12 mix. Let's take a look at rankingsrightnow.com, where we have machine learning algorithms that have historically trained data on previous ranking scenarios from the playoff committee and see where they might rank each of these teams on Tuesday night and what implications will that have on the Big 12 championship game. So let's go to rankingsrightnow.com. You can create yourself a free login. You can add your favorite teams, play with the what if simulation tool. But as of right now, let's take a look at the Week 15 projected rankings from the model. And let's take a look right in this area right here. Right in this South Carolina, Miami, Alabama, Arizona State, Ole Miss, Iowa State area, right? So what does this say to me? Well, this says right here that BYU is going to be gone. BYU is projected to stay at 18. They're not playing in the Big 12 championship game. They're essentially out of the college football playoff. So now we go to where the rankings are for Arizona State and Iowa State. That is 14 and 16 according to the rankings model predictions. What I'm very curious about is if the playoff committee will go out of their way to rank either Arizona State or Iowa State higher in the rankings. The reason for that is if we take a look at who the top conference champions will be, right? Let's say SMU wins the ACC championship. So let's say Oregon wins the Big Ten. Let's say Texas wins the SEC. Notre Dame is independent, so it doesn't matter there. Let's say SMU wins the ACC, and let's say Boise State wins their conference, right? We are now at the 4 byes, because those will be the 4 highest ranked teams for the college football playoff, right? That's how the rules work. Now, those will be the top 4 seeds. Therefore, we now need to start going into all of the rest of the pack. So we just go essentially through 12 in that scenario. Arizona State and Iowa State are not included in that scenario. So that would be an enormous problem for the playoff committee to try and explain why the Big 12 does not have any representation in the college football playoff. That would be borderline unacceptable. So either Arizona State and Iowa State are going to have to play each other at a 14 and 16, and one of them is going to have to jump all the way up to 11 or 12, which would push out a potential South Carolina. South Carolina, Miami, Alabama, and Ole Miss do not play in their championship game. They all desperately need that final game. What happens if Clemson wins the ACC? Do you drop out SMU from the top 12 and bring in a Clemson in at 11 and 12? Right? Because even so, that's another strange scenario. Let's go through that. Let's say Clemson wins. Let's say Arizona State wins and Clemson wins. If Arizona State wins, they could move up to a 12 or even a 13, for example, and they would still be, and let's say SMU drops below that. Then Arizona State grabs a spot in the rankings because they will be one of the top 4 conference champions. That means the ACC is completely out. Or at least you have to put a Clemson or SMU down at the very bottom. So you have this weird situation where Clemson loses to South Carolina. Are they going to get punished for that loss? Typically, right? Typically, we see a drop of 4, 5, or 6. If you look at all of the previous rankings, when a team loses in that position, they drop down that amount. So, crazy, weird scenarios that the playoff committee kind of put themselves in, right? By not giving any attribution to BYU or Iowa State or Colorado or Arizona State, they put themselves in this really weird scenario where someone's going to get their feelings hurt. And it could be an entire conference, right? Now, you could make the argument that BYU had everything in front of them. They blew it. Colorado had everything in front of them. They blew it, right? Arizona State and Iowa State are the only two that kind of started at the bottom and have crept their way up and continued to stay up over the last couple of weeks. So, a weird scenario that could be going down with the rankings. And that Tuesday rankings release is going to tell us everything that we need to know of, are they pitting themselves in a corner? Or are they actually going to set themselves up for success to say, we're going to put Arizona State up at 12 to try and give us a little bit more wiggle room for when Arizona State wins? If Iowa State beats a 12, do they swap places with them? Where does Clemson only drop down to 15 so that if SMU loses, we can slide SMU out and Clemson in? This brings really, really troubling news for teams like Miami, for teams like South Carolina and Alabama. You just don't know where all of these. When they expanded the playoffs to 12, it was like, oh, okay, this is going to make things a lot more easy. It just made things a lot more complicated, right? Even if you didn't have. Even if the top four is also a big question mark with Notre Dame and Penn State and Iowa State and Georgia, right? That's a big question mark. But now you have like a group, you have a conference now that is going to be fighting for whether they should be in of the college football playoff. And not only that, do they deserve a bye in certain scenarios? Let's say Arizona State wins big. SMU loses to Clemson. Arizona State might now get a bye in the top four rankings or the top four seeds for the college football playoff, because Oregon would have that one, Georgia or Texas would have the SEC, Boise State would have their conference, and now you're up to an ACC or a Big 12 conference that's going to get that final spot. So, and it goes to the highest ranked team of the conference champion. So it has to be either SMU, Arizona State, Iowa State, or Clemson. That's a very strange scenario. So I would have to say that the playoff committee is probably begging that Clemson or that SMU wins to make it a lot easier for them. But the Big 12 is going to be the biggest question mark, and they've had that conference might have had the most exciting games of the entire year. So to leave an entire conference out is going to be a really, really complicated question. So stick with the triple option with Paul Catalina all week to get all of this information. 365 Sports, they'll be going through all of the different scenarios, all of the fun rankings. We'll get our answers on Tuesday night. We'll continue to project out the where the rankings are going to be after Championship Saturday. It's going to be a crazy weekend of college football and an enormous amount of questions for the implications of where all of the teams are going to be ranked going into the college football playoff. I am Chief Rankings Officer Payton Soicher on the Triple Option with Paul Catalina.